Captain Ibrahim Traore, after surviving so many attempts at his life, has decided to come out and expose those who silenced Thomas Sankara and how exactly they did it. But before we begin, we want to ask you this question. Is Captain Ibrahim Traore the type of leader that you would love your country to have? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. He explained that back in 1983, a young and determined soldier stepped into power. He wasn't just another leader, he was a man on a mission. His name was Thomas Sankara. Sankara wanted more than just change. He wanted a revolution. In just 4 years, he pushed forward bold ideas, aiming to lift his people out of poverty and put his small West African country on the world map. But his time was cut short. On October 15th, 1987, tragedy struck. Armed men stormed his office, and in a brutal coup, he was assassinated, alongside 12 of his closest allies. What followed was chilling. His body was taken, dismembered, and buried in an unmarked grave, a fate eerily similar to the tragic end of another African hero, Patrice Lumumba, nearly 3 decades earlier. Yet Sankara's legacy was far from buried. His story is one of courage, vision, and the relentless fight for justice. It all began on December 21st, 1949, in a small village called Yako, back when Burkina Faso was still known as Upper Volta. He was the third of 10 children in a home where discipline and education were deeply valued. His father, Joseph Sankara, had served in the French army during World War II, while his mother, Marguerite Kinder, ensured her children grew up with strong morals and a sense of purpose. Thomas spent much of his childhood in Gaoua, a town surrounded by lush greenery in the country's southwest. His family was better off than most, living in a brick house that overlooked the town, a rare privilege in those days. But privilege didn't keep him from seeing reality. He played with neighbourhood kids, sat in classrooms with local students, and quickly realised that life wasn't as fair for everyone. Even as a child, he had questions. Why were some people struggling while others thrived? Why did foreign powers still hold so much influence over his homeland? Those questions would shape his path in ways no one could have predicted. Back in the days of colonial rule, a small West African territory called Upper Volta barely caught anyone's attention. The French, who controlled it, didn't see much value in the land, except for its people. They treated the country like a human supply centre, sending strong young men off to work in other colonies where France had bigger interests. Unlike wealthier French territories, Upper Volta didn't have many European administrators running things. But in the town of Gaoua, where young Thomas Sankara grew up, there were enough for him to notice a striking difference. The French lived one way, and the Africans lived another. The European kids had better clothes, better homes, and more opportunities, while African children like Thomas had to work harder for everything. Sometimes, tensions boiled over. Fights between African and European kids were common, especially in school. But one day something happened that made things even worse. It was 1960, and Upper Volta was about to become independent from France. Thomas was just 11 years old, but even at that age, he understood the importance of what was happening. So he and his friends decided to stage a little ceremony of their own. They lowered the French flag and raised the flag of the soon-to-be independent Upper Volta. A bold move for a group of kids. Not everyone was happy about it. The European children didn't take it lightly. And before long, a fight broke out between the two groups. Thomas wasn't even directly involved, but that didn't matter. The school director wanted him punished and ordered his father to beat him. His father refused. Instead of getting caught up in fights or distractions, Thomas Sankara threw himself into his studies. He was a natural at math and French, 2 subjects that would serve him well in the future. Outside of school, he was active in church, joining a scout troop, and dedicating time to religious studies. Some of the priests saw his potential. They encouraged him to become a priest and even suggested he attend a seminary. Thomas was open to the idea, but at the same time, he took an exam to enter a regular state-run secondary school. He passed. When his father told the priest that Thomas had chosen a different path, they were disappointed. Their response? "You didn't pray hard enough." But Thomas wasn't looking back. At his new school, he continued to shine, top of his class in math and French, but also active in theatre and sports. He was smart, disciplined, and well respected by both his teachers and classmates. Meanwhile, Upper Volta was falling apart. The excitement of independence had faded, and the country's first president, Maurice Yameogo, wasn't exactly the inspiring leader people had hoped for. Thomas Sankara had always been curious about the world, but it wasn't until he started digging into political ideas that his perspective truly began to shift. For the first time, he was seeing Upper Volta's struggles through a revolutionary lens. By the time he graduated from the military academy 3 years later, he wasn't just a soldier, he was a thinker, eager to learn more. Only 2 students from his class were chosen for elite officer training in Madagascar. Sankara was one of them. In October 1969, he landed in Madagascar, where his education expanded far beyond traditional military training. He wasn't just learning about strategy and combat, he was studying agriculture, rural development, and ways to improve farming practices. These ideas would later become the backbone of his leadership. But his thirst for knowledge didn't stop there. While others focused solely on military drills, Sankara was secretly educating himself on political ideologies. He read everything he could get his hands on about revolutionary movements and global struggles for independence. By 1974, he was back in Upper Volta, but he wasn't the same person who had left. Instead of just following orders, he started attending underground meetings with leftist groups and trade unions, always in civilian clothes, always in secret. The government strictly forbade these gatherings, but that didn't stop him. He wanted to understand the people's struggles firsthand. These connections would prove crucial in the years ahead. Then, on November 25th, 1980, a military coup shook the country. Colonel Saye Zerbo seized power, claiming he wanted to restore order, but his government was weak from the start. Sankara watched from the sidelines until late 1981, when he was unexpectedly brought into the regime as Minister of Information. That turned out to be a big mistake for Zerbo. Instead of towing the line, Sankara used his position to expose government corruption. When the regime became more oppressive, he refused to stay silent. He resigned in protest and paid the price. He was arrested and placed under house arrest. Meanwhile, discontent was growing among younger, more radical officers. Just a year later, on November 7th, 1982, another coup took place. This time, Captain Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo took over and brought Sankara back into the spotlight, appointing him Prime Minister on January 10th, 1983. By now, Sankara had lost all faith in the country's military elite. He saw them as nothing more than opportunists, more interested in wealth and status than protecting their people. A war only deepened his disillusionment, reinforcing his belief that the army's leadership was out of touch with reality. Despite everything, his career was moving forward. In 1976, he became commander of Upper Volta's Commando Training Centre, where he gained respect for his discipline and leadership. Then, 2 years later, fate introduced him to a man who would change his life, Captain Blay Compaoré. They met in Morocco, and what started as a simple acquaintance soon became a deep friendship. As Prime Minister, Sankara's influence was growing. His international travels took him to Libya, where he met Muammar Gaddafi. He also attended the Non-Aligned Summit in New Delhi, India, rubbing shoulders with Fidel Castro, Mozambique's Samora Machel, and Grenada's Maurice Bishop, leaders who had carved out their own paths in global politics. While Thomas Sankara remained focused on his work at the military training centre and settling into family life, he couldn't ignore the harsh reality surrounding him. Everywhere he looked, the struggles of his people were impossible to miss. Upper Volta was one of the poorest countries on the planet. Out of its 7 million citizens, most lived in small rural villages, barely scraping by. The economy was in shambles, with the average person earning just $211 a year. Education was a luxury. Fewer than 1 in 10 people could read or write, and only a small fraction of children ever made it past primary school. But the situation was even more dire when it came to survival. Hunger was everywhere. Years of drought, failing crops and soil erosion left families struggling to put food on the table. Diseases ran rampant, and without proper healthcare, life expectancy was shockingly low. Just 44 years on average. Sankara was furious. He saw firsthand how the people of Upper Volta were being crushed under the weight of poverty and neglect. Something had to change. During his time in Ouagadougou, the capital, and on military assignments in France and Morocco, Sankara started building connections with like-minded individuals, those who believed in radical change. Among them was Captain Blaise Compaoré, a young officer who shared his vision. Sankara knew change was necessary, but he also understood that timing was everything. Revolutions weren't just about passion, they required patience, planning, and strategy. So for the moment, he and his allies waited. Then, in November 1980, a coup rocked the country. Colonel Séyé Zerbo seized power, promising stability, but his regime quickly started to crack. In an attempt to shore up his government, he appointed Sankara as Minister of Information in late 1981, a decision he would soon regret. Sankara saw his new position as a platform to expose corruption, and he didn't hold back. He supported journalists in uncovering government abuses, giving a voice to those who had none. But when the regime turned more oppressive, cracking down on dissent, Sankara refused to stay silent. He resigned in protest, denouncing the government for its brutality and corruption. For that, he was arrested and placed under house arrest. But change was brewing. On November 7, 1982, another coup took place. This time, led by Captain Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo. With younger, more radical officers gaining influence, Ouédraogo saw value in Sankara's growing popularity and appointed him as Prime Minister on January 10, 1983. Now in a more powerful position, Sankara took his message beyond Upper Volta's borders. He travelled to Libya to meet with Muammar Gaddafi, attended the non-aligned summit in New Delhi, and had conversations with some of the most influential revolutionary leaders of the time. Fidel Castro, Samora Machel of Mozambique, and Maurice Bishop of Grenada. But his growing anti-imperialist stance and fiery speeches against corruption and foreign influence made him a threat to the country's elite. Especially President Ouédraogo, who wanted to maintain the status quo. Rather than playing it safe, Sankara used his position to push for change even harder. He encouraged workers to rise up, called out corrupt politicians, and challenged the power of traditional leaders who kept the country tied to old, oppressive systems. His radical foreign policy stance only deepened the divide between him and the ruling elite. Back in France, government officials were starting to get nervous. They had been watching the political shifts in Upper Volta, and Thomas Sankara's rising influence was not sitting well with them. A former colony openly challenging foreign influence. That was a problem. Behind closed doors, conservative military officers in President Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo's government were urged to take action. In May 1983, they made their move, ordering Sankara's arrest along with several of his closest allies. But things didn't go as planned. The moment word got out, the streets of Ouagadougou erupted in protest. High school students, young people from struggling neighbourhoods, and trade unionists all poured into the streets, chanting for Sankara's release. Their message was loud and clear. Free Sankara. Some even turned their anger toward France, accusing the former colonial power of pulling the strings behind the scenes. Meanwhile, resistance was forming in secret. Civilians began organising underground groups, while factions within the military quietly prepared to strike back. One of the strongest holdouts was a paratrooper base in Pau, still under the command of Captain Blaise Compaoré, a close friend and loyal supporter of Sankara. Then came the turning point. On August 4, 1983, Blaise Compaoré led a battalion of 250 paratroopers straight into Ouagadougou. They took control of key installations, working alongside other military units and groups of armed civilians who were ready to fight. By nightfall, it was all over. That evening, Thomas Sankara's voice rang out over the radio. He announced the fall of the government and the creation of the National Council of the Revolution, CNR. At just 34 years old, he was now the youngest head of state in Africa. But Sankara wasn't just interested in wearing the title of president. He had a mission. His first target? Crushing poverty. In 1983 and 1984, a devastating drought had left the country in crisis. Food was scarce and hunger was everywhere. Determined to make Upper Volta self-sufficient, Sankara launched radical agricultural reforms. He nationalised land and mineral resources, cutting out the wealthy elites who had controlled them for years. Instead of allowing big landowners to hoard property, he redistributed farmland directly to peasants. The result? Crop production surged. Farmers could finally grow enough to feed their families and supply local markets, a step toward ending the country's reliance on foreign food aid. But Sankara's vision went beyond just food security. In 1984, he took a symbolic and powerful step. He changed the country's name. The colonial era name, Upper Volta, was wiped from history. From that moment on, the nation would be called Burkina Faso, which means land of upright people. His mission was clear: break free from the legacy of colonialism and build a country rooted in pride, self-reliance and dignity. Sankara's government abolished forced labour and tribute payments to village chiefs, eliminated rural poll taxes, and spearheaded massive public works projects, building railways, launching housing programs, and creating roads that connected remote communities. At the same time, his administration declared war on corruption. Government employees were forced to cut unnecessary spending, luxury perks were stripped away, and officials were expected to live modestly, just like the people they served. Sankara's government wasn't just focused on politics and the economy. It was on a mission to transform every aspect of life in Burkina Faso, starting with the environment. He understood that deforestation and land degradation were slowly destroying farmland and pushing communities closer to famine. Instead of waiting for outside help, his administration launched an ambitious nationwide project to plant 10 million trees to stop the spread of the desert and restore agricultural land. But Sankara's vision went beyond just planting trees. He wanted to reshape society itself, tackling deep-rooted inequalities and injustices that had long been ignored. Women, the poor, and rural farmers stood to gain the most from his sweeping reforms. Unlike many leaders of his time, Sankara wasn't afraid to challenge harmful cultural practices. He spoke out forcefully against forced and underage marriages, polygamy, and female genital mutilation, calling them outdated traditions that had no place in a just society. In one speech, he made it clear that true progress couldn't happen if half the population was still being oppressed. Then came one of his boldest social experiments. In September 1984, he declared a national Women's Day, but not in the way most people expected. Instead of speeches and celebrations, men were required to swap roles with women for the day. Husbands had to do the shopping, cook meals, and take care of the home, tasks that were traditionally left to women. It was a lesson in empathy. Sankara wanted men to experience firsthand what women went through every single day. The idea sparked debate, but it also opened many eyes to the struggles of women across the country. Healthcare was another urgent priority. Burkina Faso's child mortality rate was one of the worst in the world, with diseases like measles, yellow fever, and meningitis taking thousands of young lives. Sankara didn't wait for foreign aid. He launched one of the most ambitious vaccination campaigns Africa had ever seen. In just a short time, over 2.5 million children were immunized, saving countless lives and dramatically reducing child mortality rates. But Sankara didn't stop there. His government built hundreds of health centers, ensuring that even remote villages had access to basic medical care. By the time he was done, Burkina Faso had 284 childbirth clinics and 87 pharmacies. Education also got a massive boost. Before Sankara's leadership, literacy levels were shockingly low, with most children never setting foot in a classroom. He launched a nationwide literacy drive, making education a top priority. The results? In just 4 years, the literacy rate skyrocketed from 13% to 73%, one of the fastest educational transformations in Africa. But what made Sankara truly different from other leaders was his personal approach to leadership. Unlike many African presidents who surrounded themselves with luxury and grand ceremonies, Sankara rejected all forms of self-glorification. He banned the display of his portraits in public buildings, refused to have his name chanted at rallies, and avoided extravagant motorcades. While other presidents drove around in expensive limousines, Sankara stuck to a modest car. He dressed simply, often showing up to events in a tracksuit or a football jersey, blending into the crowd rather than standing apart. On some occasions, he would arrive at public gatherings unnoticed, quietly standing at the back, while people slowly realised that their leader was among them, not as a ruler, but as an equal. Even in government, he discouraged luxury and called on officials to live simply. Ministers were expected to cut unnecessary expenses, and instead of lavish parties and overseas trips, Sankara's administration poured resources into development projects. Unlike most leaders, Thomas Sankara didn't believe in luxury. While other presidents enjoyed lavish perks, He set a radically different example, one that made many in the government uncomfortable. His monthly salary was barely $450, a fraction of what most African heads of state earned. He refused to travel in expensive, chauffeur-driven Mercedes, and instead of flying first class, he made sure government officials flew economy, just like ordinary citizens. At the time, Burkina Faso's public sector drained a massive chunk of the national budget. Government workers enjoyed generous salaries and endless perks, while the majority of people in the country struggled to get by. Sankara wasn't having it. He slashed unnecessary allowances, cut back on bonuses that had become the norm, and forced top officials to make sacrifices. While these cuts mostly impacted higher-ranking government employees, they still didn't sit well with many civil servants who had grown accustomed to the benefits. But Sankara didn't stop there. He sold off 2/3 of the government's car fleet, keeping only small, practical vehicles for official use. Ministers were strictly prohibited from using government cars for personal errands or business ventures. If a vehicle wasn't needed for work, it stayed parked. Even international trips were stripped down. Gone were the 5-star hotels and lavish expenses. When government officials travelled abroad, they were expected to stay in budget accommodations, often at Burkina Faso's embassies or consulates. A staff member at Burkina Faso's United Nations mission in New York once shared a story from Sankara's 1984 visit. Instead of booking luxury hotel rooms for his ministers, he had mattresses laid out on the floors of the mission's offices. When some officials grumbled, Sankara reminded them, "The money we save here can build wells and schools for our people back home." In 1987, during his final year in office, Thomas Sankara did something unheard of. He made his entire financial situation public, revealing every source of income and every asset he and his wife, Mariam, owned. For a sitting president, this level of transparency was shocking. But Sankara wanted to prove a point. Leadership wasn't about wealth, power, or privilege. Unlike many world leaders who built fortunes while in office, Sankara's lifestyle had barely changed. His 2 sons attended regular public schools, receiving the same education as any other Burkinabe child. Mariam continued working at her government job in the transportation sector, showing up to the office just like any other employee. Even his parents lived exactly as they had before. His father, now retired, stayed in the same modest home, while his mother continued selling spices and condiments to make extra money. Sankara refused to let his position elevate his family above the people he served, but his vision went far beyond personal sacrifice. Across the world, Sankara became known for challenging the economic stranglehold that Western nations still had on Africa. He openly criticised foreign aid and loans, calling them a modern form of colonialism that kept African nations trapped in dependency and debt. He didn't need soldiers or war to recognise imperialism. To him, it came in subtler forms: loans with hidden strings, food aid that destroyed local markets, and economic agreements designed to keep Africa in a cycle of reliance. Imperialism isn't just about invading nations with guns, he once declared. It's a system of control, through debt, aid, and blackmail. We refuse to be ruled this way. Sankara took a bold step, rejecting loans from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. Instead of borrowing money, he pushed for self-sufficiency, believing that Burkina Faso had the resources to sustain itself. It just needed better organisation. "We have enough to feed ourselves," he argued, "but because we are disorganised, we are forced to beg for food. This dependency has turned us into a nation of beggars. We must break free." Nowhere was his passion more evident than at the Organisation of African Unity, OAU. Standing before his fellow African leaders, he delivered some of his most fiery speeches, challenging them to demand economic freedom and take back control of their own resources. Thomas Sankara wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and when it came to Africa's crushing debt, he made sure the world heard him loud and clear. At a major African conference, he stood before leaders from across the continent and asked a simple question: who among us actually wants to pay this debt? He let the silence hang for a moment before continuing: "If you do, feel free to catch the next flight to the World Bank and pay it yourself. The rest of us have better things to do." It was a bold statement, but Sankara wasn't just being provocative, he was making a point. African nations, he argued, had already paid enough. Unlike Europe, which was helped to rebuild after World War II, Africa was instead being forced to compensate the very powers that had plundered and exploited it for centuries. To him, this wasn't just unfair, it was a scam. Sankara urged African nations to unite, to reject debt repayment as a collective, and to break free from financial systems designed to keep them weak and dependent. He believed self-reliance was the only way forward, but not everyone welcomed his ideas, especially those who benefited from the existing system. His radical push for change made him powerful enemies, both inside and outside Burkina Faso, and ultimately, his boldness would cost him his life, but we'll get to that later. For all the progress Sankara brought, his rule was not without controversy. Beneath the surface of empowerment and reform, there were cracks in his revolution, and not everyone agreed with his methods. Take his revolutionary defense committees, designed to be grassroots organizations, where ordinary people could have a say in their communities. But over time, these groups gained unchecked power, sometimes being used to silence opposition and enforce strict loyalty. Then there were the People's Revolutionary Tribunals. On paper, they were meant to hold corrupt officials accountable and punish those who sabotaged the revolution. But in reality, many saw them as rushed, unfair trials that sometimes served as a way for individuals to settle personal grudges. Even Sankara himself later admitted on camera that some had abused the system. On the economic front, his decision to dismantle the feudal farming system was meant to free peasants from exploitation. Instead, it sparked tensions with traditional chiefs who had long controlled land and labour. What was meant as liberation led to resistance and social unrest. And then came his strained relationship with labour unions. At first, Sankara championed workers' rights, but when unions began to challenge his policies, things changed. He banned trade unions and political parties, arguing that they were obstacles to progress. The turning point came in 1986, when teachers organised a protest. Instead of negotiating, Sankara crushed the demonstration, a decision that left many of his former supporters disillusioned. He then dissolved unions altogether, replacing them with committees for the defence of the revolution, which only deepened public frustration. What started as a movement for the people was now alienating some of them. Thomas Sankara's outspoken defiance of Western influence didn't sit well with powerful figures abroad, especially France, the former colonial ruler of Burkina Faso. He openly criticised foreign aid, exposed the hidden cost of international loans, and called out European leaders for their ongoing control over African nations. By 1987, his boldness had come at a cost. Sankara was becoming increasingly isolated on the world stage. His enemies weren't just foreign powers, he was also losing support within Africa itself. One of his biggest opponents was Ivorian President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, a close ally of the French government. Together they saw Sankara as a dangerous disruptor who was making too much noise. Even French President François Mitterrand had clashed with Sankara. On more than one occasion, Sankara had publicly embarrassed him, pushing back against France's influence in Africa. Mitterrand, though careful with his words, admitted that Sankara was brilliant and fiercely committed to his country. But he also thought he was too radical, too impatient, and too sharp-tongued for his own good. As tensions grew, so did the threats against his leadership. In May 1984, whispers of a coup attempt surfaced. A group of alleged conspirators was arrested, tried, and swiftly executed in June. But this was only the beginning. The real betrayal wouldn't come from foreign enemies, it would come from within his own circle. Sankara's closest ally and longtime friend, Captain Blaise Compaoré, would be the one to turn against him. For years they had been brothers in arms and standing side by side in the fight for revolution. But after the August 1983 uprising that brought Sankara to power, cracks began to form in their relationship. Some say their visions for the country began to clash. Sankara, driven by his unyielding passion for radical change, wanted to tear down every piece of the old system. No compromises, no slowing down. His reforms were sweeping, fast, and often disruptive. Compaoré, while still a revolutionary, was more cautious. He believed that some change needed to happen gradually, and he started to question the pace and approach of Sankara's leadership. Blaise Compaoré had always been at Sankara's side, but as time passed, their paths began to diverge. Some say he grew uneasy, watching Sankara push through bold, sweeping reforms at lightning speed, transforming the country overnight. Others believe it wasn't just discomfort, it was ambition. Power has a way of changing people. On the morning of October 15th, 1987, an important meeting took place. Sankara and Compaoré sat together, discussing plans for a new political movement, one that would unify their supporters and strengthen the revolution. But before the day was over, everything would fall apart. Suddenly, gunfire erupted inside the presidential compound. What had been a place of leadership and strategy became a scene of chaos. When the shooting stopped, 12 people lay dead. Among them was Thomas Sankara, the heart of the revolution. His body was mutilated, and in an effort to erase him from history, he was buried in an unmarked grave. His widow, Mariam, and their 2 children fled the country, knowing they would never be safe under the new regime. Yet, despite these efforts to silence the truth, the world quickly learned what had happened. Blaise Compaoré, now the new ruler of Burkina Faso, announced that Sankara had died of natural causes, a claim that no one believed. But the coup wasn't just about removing Sankara, it was about erasing everything he stood for. Though Compaoré pretended to mourn his fallen comrade, his actions told a very different story. One by one, he removed Sankara's loyal supporters from government. He reversed many of Sankara's policies, and within just 3 years he had welcomed foreign financial institutions with open arms, accepting a massive IMF loan, and implementing structural adjustments that Sankara had fiercely opposed. Western leaders who had once kept their distance from Sankara now embraced Compaoré with open arms. His presidency brought back the luxuries Sankara had banned. His portrait was placed in government offices, and he even purchased a presidential jet. One day I'll do a full deep dive into Compaoré's story, but for now, Thomas Sankara's legacy lives on. He was more than a leader. He was a symbol of defiance, hope, and the fight for justice. His words, his vision, and his relentless pursuit of truth continue to inspire people across the world, reminding us that standing up for what is right always comes at a price. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.